I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak in response to receiving the AERA Distinguished Public Service Award in 2025. I'm humbled and honored to receive the award and appreciative as well as a bit daunted by the opportunity to deliver this address. I'm very sorry that I can't be there with you in person. I've been a university president for about 8 years now, and I am lucky in a day if I can read the headlines of Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and a few listservs that I watch, to see what is happening in education policy nationally, and scan the national and Maine news as possible. I have to say that the pile of copies of Educational Researcher, the Journal for Research in Mathematics Education, and other publications that I would very much like to read just continues to grow. So thus today's remarks are built around examples of how, as the award citation says, I have been engaged in, quote, efforts to increase recognition and support for education research, and some thoughts about where we are today and tomorrow. There is some key literature that I'll use to help frame my remarks, but primarily I'll draw on examples from my own experience. My work at the National Academy of Sciences, where I was director of the Mathematical Sciences Education Board, which has been reconstituted and restarted. If there are people in the audience who are aware of that board, it's really good news. Also, my years at the National Science Foundation, my roles in helping to develop pre-K through 12 mathematics standards, and my current job as a university president. Extraordinary leaders, colleagues, and mentors have been pivotal along the way, and I would like to recognize a few. Glenda Lappin, Cora Merritt, Mary Lindquist, France Cordova, Deborah Ball, Hyman Bass, Bob Floden, and some who are no longer here, Bill Schmidt, Janice Earle, and Karen King. Over my career, I have found myself in many positions and situations where, grounded in my doctoral preparation and experiences as a researcher and practitioner in mathematics education, I could see how the work or the project would always generate a de novo conversation by well-intentioned people about whatever the problem was, frequently in the policy domain. People would bring opinions, personal experiences, best guesses, wisdom of practice, expert knowledge, or vague allusions to the research to advance the debate or the conversation or the policy decision on a wide variety of education topics. And over these situations over the years, I used to find it frustrating when I knew that there were bodies of research that could inform those conversations. But over my career, I found it interesting to try to figure out how to bring the research in productive ways. Changes in policy contexts, societal needs, institutional circumstances, and even the new knowledge and tools that research produces do affect the evolution of research. And reciprocally, research, with an eye toward the public good, can influence, inform, and impact policy, society, institutions, and the quest for more new knowledge and tools. So how can this bidirectionality be lifted up and even accelerated over periods of time when changes around us happen rapidly? And how can individuals, through the positions and the roles that they play, further the integration of research and policy and practice? And so those are the questions I'm exploring today. One of my go-to ways of thinking about this question was proposed by Ed Silver in 1990. He wrote, quote, educational research suffers from a fairly widespread belief that someday a research study will provide the ultimate answer to each of the most pressing questions of educational practice, and I would add policy. And then he goes on to suggest that the theoretical constructs, the methods, and the findings of research all should be used as we try to embark upon this kind of work. This perspective can be useful for the boundary crossers, and there are many sources about that literature, for the intermediary organizations, so see Lubinsky, Scott, and Debray, and the translators, see Kearney, Boaz, and Oliver. And I'll return to Ed's simple framing in my examples. Research for the public good seems central to public service work in education, at least in many dimensions of educational experience. From my experience and well supported in the literature, research may stand its best chances of having impact and enduring when researchers and perhaps the boundary crossers and others frame research problems to address potential users' needs, contemplate a range of questions, and interpret findings for multiple publics. The work of Cynthia Coburn, Bill Penuel, and others on research practice partnerships in education makes this case soundly and argues for the co-construction of knowledge. They point out the importance of focusing on problems of practice and identify the idea of, quote, mutualism, the focus of the work being jointly negotiated and shared authority being central. So using examples from STEM education, federal STEM research leadership, the mathematics standards movement, and institutional change in higher education, I hope to illustrate how public service can enable the promotion of research to inform and impact the public good. So here's the flow for my talk. I'll talk about educational research as a public good a bit. I'll talk about using educational research in policy development, developing capacity to do this, and then capitalizing on policy to advance research in changing times. So first, educational research as a public good. I was very fortunate to serve in 2 different stints for more than a dozen years in positions at the National Science Foundation. Required reading at the NSF was the report Science, the Endless Frontier, authored by MIT faculty member Vannevar Bush in 1945. And I like this quote, which is from the letter of transmittal and summary of the report. Scientific progress is one essential key to our security as a nation, to our better health, to more jobs, and to a higher standard of living, and to our cultural progress. And by the way, aren't these photographs coming from the Artemis II mission spectacular? That's what's on the left. So this claim was made during a time in U.S. history when the argument was being built for the support of science coming from the federal government in partnership with universities. And as an aside, you may be following the current discussion of where research should be reported and how, particularly in science. The government, higher education, the private sector, and philanthropy. There are new opportunities for the mutualism that Coburn and Penuel describe. But back to Vannevar Bush. The idea of sharing the costs of research by universities and the federal government, as well as the formation of the National Science Foundation, came out of his work. And we all know that the F&A policy apparatus is currently the topic of much attention at the federal level and within universities. It's a claim that science, with some caveats, is good for the public. And indeed, there are treatises written on this, and so many of the results are intrinsically tangible, putting humans on the moon and orbiting beyond it, curing some kinds of cancer, creating the internet, building our cybersecurity systems, making food safer, and so forth. But it has never seemed clear to me that research and education is automatically included when such claims are being made. Yet I take the view that the question is not whether education research matters or is relevant, but how it matters, for whom, and for how long, and if the research, including the theoretical constructs, the methods, and the findings, if the research that might matter is the research that we have. There might be something to learn by looking outside of education and at history about the role of research. And since I am president of a land-grant university, this example comes from the domains with which I deal pretty much every day. Here's an early call for use-inspired research enshrined in policy or law, actually, almost 140 years ago, that's still in place, requiring practical research for the agricultural experiment stations that exist in all states, usually through universities. This policy provides funding for research-based improvement of the agriculture industry, which is a $1.5 trillion industry in the U.S. Incidentally, at Maine, we have 5 research farms, research greenhouses and gardens, a university forest, and labs devoted to topics like soil testing and spruce budworm infestation. This is really from the Hatch Act, which lays out this law, and it speaks to the importance of useful and practical information on subjects connected with agriculture and to promote scientific investigation and experiment. It's wonderful to have this kind of focus instantiated in law. Clearly, farmers are one of the many publics who care about research in agriculture, and for them, the research is integrated into and impacts their daily work in ways that I hope we can aspire to for education. But it doesn't work the same way for educational research and education. And we do have many publics. In preparing for this talk, I was led to John Dewey's report, The Public and Its Problems, which was a foray by him in 1927. And he outlines a reality that's not very different almost 100 years later. He's speaking about imagining a European person looking at the local conditions of schools and asking about why the system seems to be working, and asks about what method of administration is followed, what the course of study is, and what the authorized methods of teaching might be. And so if an American in his quote is replying, he might say something about, well, it depends on the state or the county or the town or even some section of a town called a district, and so on and so on. And then here's his observation. It's really very difficult to describe our education undertaking here in the United States, and this problem continues today. I would claim that today, the research and education that does allow for, in his words, moderate generalization, and can span a wide array of distributed settings in which education happens, is helpful in the policy and translation work in my experience. So how do we create policy documents and practices that respect, build, and are informed by research where we have it, while at the same time realizing that the range of people and publics with which we engage do not have shared knowledge or experience, but do have questions and responsibilities of their own, and that the questions we study as researchers may not be the questions for which our stakeholder publics need answers. Long after my time working on NCTM standards, I joined a committee working on state standards. We were discussing the third grade standard for fluently adding and subtracting within 1,000. I can't tell if we have mathematics education colleagues in the audience, but you know about this, and maybe others do too. The very accomplished and experienced group of classroom teachers, administrators, and teacher educators was debating whether students should be able to explore and invent their own algorithms, or whether the, quote, standard algorithm should simply be taught directly. For those not in math ed, you should know that this was one of the more highly contested debates during the math war years, probably from the mid-90s at least up until the present. And searching on Google Scholar a couple of days ago under standard algorithm for third grade subtraction versus invented strategies, I got 274,000 results. So it's a heavily discussed topic. This group of well-intentioned folks, into which I had sort of been parachuted as a newcomer, was struggling with this. So I really wanted to say, folks, this is settled. Just look at the Common Core standards. There's a national consensus on this, and you don't need to re-discuss this topic from scratch for this state. You could save so much time. But in the end, the standard that they came up with looked exactly like the Common Core standard written by a national group for third grade subtraction. I've come to understand over my time that their discussion was really important. And the lesson for me is that every new group still needs to work through some of the old issues, and how to support and facilitate that becomes an important skill. So this is a great example of how, even with a huge investment in reaching consensus that takes into account research, experience, wisdom of practice, in the example of the Common Core, in the end, decisions in the US, as you all know, are very local and are informed by local experience. Another important dimension of moving research into practice and policy, I think, has to do with understanding the questions of funders. Because funders, in a sense, are policymakers taken broadly in that they put money behind priorities. A leader in private philanthropy that generously funds public education in Maine has asked me these questions over the years. What's the best way to introduce computing into the K-12 curriculum? And he's interested because he's ready to make grants to people who are proposing ideas for doing this. Are cascading teacher development models a really good bet? Do they work? Is it possible to integrate computational thinking into mathematics and science curriculum at the elementary levels? So I guess my point is that in this kind of work, bringing research into policy requires really taking the time to listen to the stakeholders, the many publics, if we have hope for the research being for the public good in our very complex and dynamic field. Second part of my talk is about using educational research in policy development, and the big point here is this is an iterative exercise. I joined the NSF in 2007 as director of the newly formed Division of Research on Learning in Formal and Informal Settings in what was then the Directorate for Education and Human Resources, EHR. That directorate has since been renamed STEM EDU. When I arrived, I learned that my responsibility would include leading the response for programs in the division on an accountability program run by the Office of Management and Budget called the Program Assessment Rating Tool, PART. It was described by OMB at the time as, quote, a diagnostic tool to draw on program performance and evaluation information for forming conclusions about program benefits and recommending adjustments to improve results. It was a part of GPRA, the Government Performance Results Act of 1993, another law that required federal agencies to manage performance by setting goals, measuring results, and reporting progress. So I vividly remember arriving as a new division director and being given the draft GPRA part goal for something that was called the Discovery Research K-12, the DRK-12 program. DRK-12 was a funding program to support the development of K-12 STEM instructional materials. Okay, so it was an outgrowth of NSF's funding of curriculum and instructional materials over many, many years. But here was the draft goal that was on my desk when I arrived. Quote, the DRK-12, it was close to this, the DRK-12 investments will lead to an increase in NAEP scores in mathematics and science. That's what we were going to need to prove. This seemed unreasonable. How could a portfolio of hundreds of funded innovative projects that ranged from introducing science concepts in some authentic way in pre-kindergarten settings to creating very progressive middle school math curricula, which included topics that were not on NAEP, possibly be expected to influence NAEP scores? And moreover, could we responsibly make any causal connection between the investment in this large portfolios and the NAEP scores? So working with colleagues, we changed the goal to this. Quote, we will reach a minimum number of resources, that is, instructional programs, models, or interventions developed by the DRK-12 program, whose effectiveness has been examined using rigorous methods. That wasn't a perfect goal either. This kind of a policy change in Silver's scheme was about the methods of research and maybe even the theoretical constructs informing policy and how that work is iterative. Today, the DRK-12 program has greatly changed. The government approach to accountability has evolved over those many years. But the hope is that what we did then did add to the overall thinking over time. We do have examples where efforts to test the potential to use research to inform practice and policy have occurred through the federal government directly. The National Mathematics Advisory Panel was launched in 2006 and concluded with a report in 2008. The National Reading Panel completed its work in 2000. I participated on the math panel as the NSF representative. It was formed in response to an executive order by President George W. Bush. So a president directing the need for a study to be done by the field. It was in response to the math wars, to performance in math at K through 8 and other factors. It was likely expensive, managed by the U.S. Department of Ed. And the panel was looking at research on math learning, particularly in preparation for algebra. And the members of the panel were the many publics, the many stakeholders, teachers, mathematicians, education researchers, research methodologists, federal employees, mathematics educators, and more. The report emphasized the importance of conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and automaticity with basic facts, and did lay out elements of a focused curriculum. There has been some comparison over the years of the impact of the National Math Panel to that of the National Reading Panel, particularly around methodology and policy impact. One interesting process with the math panel was that the panel and the staff reviewed 16,000 plus studies, and this was sort of in the pre-AI days. Only a small proportion of those studies met, quote, the high standards of evidence that were defined by the panel at the time. And then we created tiers of evidence, strong, moderately strong, and suggestive, because otherwise, I think the research base would not have been able to contribute to the actual report. But now I wonder if that weakened the impact as the standards and use of research in the National Reading Panel were different and leaned toward what at the time was considered more rigorous. The debates there over some of the most minute points, including, I might add, the standard algorithm that I mentioned earlier, were painful, challenging, and really very constructive. Some of us tried to bring research findings when we had them to the table, and sometimes that worked, but not when it ran up against other, maybe research-based arguments from other fields, such as mathematics, and from a very wide range of perspective. But what I can say is that those discussions are crucial to the translation of research into policy and practice. Both of the reports, the math panel and the reading panel, for different reasons, met with critique, and historians of education will look someday at the impact of these expensive government-driven initiatives. But they are examples of how researchers, the public, and the policymakers have worked to bring research to the policy world. The general sense that I've seen in the literature is that the reading panel did have a greater impact on the practice of teaching reading than the national math panel. If that's the case, does that have to do with the nature of the body of research available and what lessons can we learn? This brings me back to the idea of really understanding the various publics that we consider as we formulate research studies and also as we provide advice to practitioners. And again, can't see the audience, but my hunch is there are people here who are very familiar with this sort of bridging work and dealing with practitioners in order to formulate the research questions. This comment is from an experienced K-8 mathematics teacher. I asked for this comment as I was preparing a talk for NCTM, the National Council of Teachers of Math, in 2023. And I asked about what she wished she knew from research, and this was her answer, which you can read. It's about identifying the gaps, the way that those can be identified in reading. When you have a red flag automatically at certain points in reading, knowing sight words, and then there's a great support structure for developing those reading skills. And then she said, I just don't hear the same kind of alarm when students reach second grade and don't know their addition facts to 10 plus 10. So I think finding ways, constantly working to find ways to hear the practitioner's voice and incorporate that as we think about the research questions. Now I'd like to offer some thoughts on some key elements over the past many years for how we are developing increased capacity, I think, as educational research communities for enabling research to inform policy. That is notwithstanding my former colleague David Lavery's article, which has the provocative title, The Dysfunctional Pursuit of Relevance in Educational Research. And David talked about relevance and what that would mean and how much it matters that we strive for it or not. But one point he does make is he talks about the array of actors, and I think the reminder is very important. David says, think of the wide array of actors involved in education, quote, teachers, students, principals and parents, test makers, textbook publishers, educational technology producers, curriculum developers, superintendents and school board members, policymakers, politicians, and educational bureaucrats. I think that's what I was. Maybe I still am. Teacher educators and education school deans. It's a good list. I'd add more to it now from my experience in a university leadership role, which is subject matter areas within universities well beyond education have a lot to say and to think about relative to the students who come to us and how we can help them be successful. So I think we need to be thinking about university faculty broadly as well as part of the stakeholder community as we think about education research. Next part is about developing the capacity for using research to inform policy. And I have sort of five sub-bullets here. As someone who continues to believe that an important role for research is to inform policy so that we can make the world a better place, I've been thinking of what we have done as a field and what we can do more of to build the capacity of people to do this work well. One of my first thoughts is that we could try to change policies and practices using federal level mechanisms and national organizations for those who are involved in those worlds. Federal and national level education policy works is an anchor for so many intertwined areas. It has such reach in teacher ed, assessment, instructional materials, pedagogy, and standards that undergird it all. And then it gets implemented through funding policies and gatekeepers like accreditation, or the use of expensive tools that are available for learning like technologies and materials. So keeping an eye on where it's possible to have input and influence in those federal and national level activities is important for the education research community. A second thought is about acknowledging the important professional work of boundary crossing, study it as some do, and support the development in an intentional way of professionals who are interested in doing it or who have the opportunities to be doing it. I've had a career where I've been very fortunate that my work has provided the opportunities to be engaged in this kind of activity, but The conceptual frameworks which could orient the efforts might have been helpful, and maybe we could do more to develop those or to make one another aware of them. Vivian Sang offered some thoughts on what the, quote, trusted peers and intermediaries to whom policymakers turn, or, in my experience, who actually find themselves working on policy directly, should know. And she talks about using research, quote, in various ways, including instrumental, conceptual, political, imposed, and process uses. And I think I agree with her points. Unpacking that would be very useful for those who would like to take their careers in directions that involve this kind of activity. Again, I can't say enough about the wonderful literature on research practice partnerships, and there's so much to learn from that literature about also how to improve research policy partnerships. My third thought here is that our use of training and experience in educational research itself can be used to build and bring discipline to methods in the translation and infusion of research into policy. Relatively early on in my career, I was very privileged to work at the National Research Council, which is the operating arm of the National Academy of Sciences. Many of you would know the report, Adding It Up, Helping Children Learn Mathematics, from that group. NAS reports are peer-reviewed, evidence-based consensus reports. Working there, I learned firsthand about their storied report review process. That this was guided by the notion that if a statement was coming out of the National Academies in a report, it would have been painstakingly vetted by various publics that included experts in the subject matter from multiple perspectives, as well as other knowledgeable experts in other fields. Reviewers critiqued the draft report line by line. The comments were all assembled in massive tables with the original language, with the comment, with the committee's response and decision, and then with the revised version of the text if it was changed or with reasons for leaving it as it was. So in the second wave of NCTM standards, where I chaired the writing group, we used variants of the NAS report review process with the research references. The authors on the writing team would include draft text that would make a claim and attribute that claim to Smith 1995. And graduate student at the time, Don Burke, now at the University of Delaware, made tables, including any claim and its references, then found the actual references, gauged whether they aligned with the claim, and then proposed rewrites of the claim or changes in the references and so forth. I will tell you that we kind of ran out of time with that process toward the end of the project, and we needed to publish, and we hadn't really checked every single one of these instances in the last really few pages of the book, but one of the individuals had been a close watcher of mathematics education over those years, called me within, it seemed like minutes, but days, about a claim that was made toward the end of the book where he wasn't convinced that the literature supported it well. So there were close readers, and that was really valuable to that process. As a part of developing the book, we sent a draft out nationally to reviewers, and in a paper by Martin and Burke, they recounted this. And this was the question that we asked. How well is research being used to document claims being made, and are the research citations helpful? So this was a draft document, and answer one is really nice and, talks about how this was helpful and a useful thing. But answer two, kind of the reason why they sometimes say don't read all the comments, but of course we were reading all of the comments. This was the process. Another example of an unnecessary injection of much hedged research results. So I think we have to assume that our publics are reading these kinds of documents with these kinds of eyes as they go forward. My fourth thought on this general capacity question is we need to all recognize that the policy will go on, will get formed, whether we have the research to help it or not, and whether the people who are at the table have enough familiarity with the research to bring it into the mix. And so it may be the case that could be improved a bit by even more engagement with the publics that will be the beneficiaries of these policies. I've been interested, actually I'll just tell a quick anecdote there and leave kind of the names out, but there was a policymaker at the national level. I happened to be in a meeting with him. He was looking for work that would inform some policies about teacher education that he was charged with working on. And I remember sitting with colleagues around the table, and we said, well, if we could have a conference, perhaps, we could bring together so-and-so and so-and-so, and they could help, and we could formulate that. And he said, you don't understand. It's going to press next week. We have to be able to do this now. And that, I've run into that quite a lot, and many of you in the room, I'm sure, have as well. So that becomes an interesting challenge for all of us. I've been interested for a decade in what the impacts of engaging undergraduates in research might be. NSF's famous Research Experiences for Undergraduates program is one of the most highly regarded programs within the agency and within the scientific communities. How could anyone argue against it? Engaging undergraduates in real hands-on learning across the research fields that NSF funded and funds, it seems like such a plausible and good investment. And yet remember about that GIPRA part thing I told you about. To argue for the preservation of this program, in those days at least, you needed more than the inputs, which were numbers of students who participated and the range of types of universities that had these dollars. Well, what might the impacts be? That's an educational research question. Do students learn more science? Do researchers actually reframe their questions because of the engagement of students? In 2015, Marsha Lynn published an article in Science offering a framework and some thoughts about the importance of trying to study the impact of REUs. And again, as I've told you, I'm not able to keep up, but I have not been able to find much lately on this particular topic. Yet we are at a time at the federal level where there is extreme focus on talent development for economic competitiveness in the STEM fields. And hopefully dollars are following that investment. It would be very good to be able to make arguments about the impact of research experiences for undergraduates. And I'll just give a brief example. Eventually here at UMaine, we were able to get some very generous philanthropic funding to launch a project that we called the Research Learning Experience, the RLE initiative. And currently we are offering 85 sections of first year, first semester, and some advanced courses to about 1,100 undergraduates where they get engaged in authentic research across the fields of our university the day they walk in the door. And we are completing several studies that are either underway or continuing that are looking at the question of impact. Like, does this experience actually matter for these students? And we are seeing, for an example, an impact on their engagement and their retention at the university. So the lesson, I guess, from all of that might be that in the work that is attempting to inform policy, we don't always precisely have the research we need, but that doesn't mean we should not continue to try to acquire it. My fifth thought on this topic is that when possible, if there is a way to change and influence underlying infrastructure, there can be, I believe, at least from my experience, more hope of enduring impact, and it doesn't always happen overnight. When I was at NSF, all areas of NSF reported in the annual budget request on how investments fell into three categories: discovery, which was code for research; learning, which was code for education; and infrastructure, which was ships and labs and telescopes and so forth. And over time, that shifted to be a bit more clear and more standard. The categories went to basic research, applied research, experimental development, and education training. And traditionally, almost everything that was funded in EHR was reported as education training, which didn't allow us in EHR to really make the argument that we were also a research organization funding the development of new knowledge and new understandings about learning and education. So while I was there, we had a major effort to introduce educational research into all of our funding programs, and then to develop a new way of categorizing our dollars so that certain percentages of programs could be assigned to each category. And we grew the reporting about research in EHR from something fairly small, close to zero, to many millions of dollars in alignment with where the dollars are being spent. And that really changed the conversation about the place of EHR within the agency. Now, over the years, these different kinds of frameworks do change and so on, but sometimes working with a very basic piece of infrastructure like the annual reporting on something can make a difference. And there's one more example I want to give where we also found durability. Yvonne Lai, a mathematician and mathematics education researcher at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, recounted a story in which I actually had a small part. And it began in 1993 when a mathematician and mathematics education researcher named Ed Dubinsky at Purdue University first proposed that mathematics education belonged in a list of topics that was that constituted the American Mathematical Society mathematical reviews. This was a list that categorized areas of mathematical research into their subfields, so that then as reviewers and others were looking for articles and reviewing them and so forth, they knew how to find particular topics. And in the late 90s, according to Yvonne, the AMS Committee on Education, which was chaired by Hy Bass, designated a subcommittee, which it turned out I was chairing, to propose what eventually became, in 2000, so this is, late 90s and then later, and Ed Dubinsky starting early, it became the Mathematics Subject Classification number 97, Mathematics Education. MSc 97, which you see here, along with very, very traditional mathematics topics, although because it's toward the end of the list, you do see some that are quite applied, has now become, as recently as 2024, visible in MathSciNet, which is an online platform. So by doing this work that started in 1993 with Ed Dubinsky and went through a committee and other committees and other work, this is now there, and people who are looking for mathematics education research within the mathematical reviews can find it. And that story, I think, is another example of a lot of iteration, building over lots of different people, lots of different times, hitting some good bets, and embedding research in education in places that can count. So finally now, my last section, capitalizing on policy to advance research in changing times. The big message here is to use and capitalize, I think, my advice, I guess, on the context we have, to look to whatever is current policy and guidance and draw from it. For example, the current presidential administration has issued an executive order on gold standard science. It's not the first time we've seen commentary coming from the administration about what science should be. And gold standard science means science conducted in a manner that conforms with standards of education research. I would claim that we all might share. Research, we might share many of them, I guess. Research that is reproducible, transparent, communicative of error and uncertainty, collaborative and interdisciplinary, skeptical of its findings and assumptions, structured for falsifiability of hypotheses. Now that becomes more complicated methodologically, perhaps. Subject to unbiased peer review, accepting of negative results as positive outcomes and without conflicts of interest. And I would claim there is something to build from, some common ground there. And back to my earlier points, considering many publics as we think about research and policy, including where agencies decide to put dollars, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to be opportunistic. There was news earlier this week that China has surpassed the US in research funding. According to OECD in 2024, quote, China invested $1.03 trillion in current dollar values in research and development from all sources, topping the United States' $1.01 trillion investment. So this kind of thing might be an important fact when trying to build arguments for research funding. Keep an eye on the US Department of Energy's Genesis mission, which is a really interesting AI for science activity at the Department of Energy. And you see here one of the early descriptions of it, but this process has a very strong workforce emphasis and is arguing that the nation will need workers at the PhD and master's levels who are able to advance the place for AI and the kinds of things that you see here. There are education questions sometimes embedded in these other areas. The administration also advanced an initiative on AI education for American youth, where they argue, quote, to achieve this vision, we must also invest in our educators and equip them with the tools and knowledge to not only train students about AI, okay, I wouldn't have used the language of train, but also to utilize AI in their classrooms to improve educational outcomes. So one can have various perspectives on AI, but at the same time, there are toeholds to use in some of what we see going forward. I think it's also timely to argue about the importance of public universities as being part of civic infrastructure for the local and public good. I just had an editorial recently in a local paper with this headline, "Think of Maine as the R&D department of Maine itself." And I think being prepared to help make the argument of the importance of the university within the state is a kind of public service that can be done fairly locally and certainly can be done legitimately by education researchers who bring so much to this discussion. So I'll conclude by saying that no matter what one's public service role is in our very broad and dispersed sector of education, I believe there is a place for educational research to make a difference. It might take a long time, and for the changes around us to also lead us to new and useful and usable research. And we can keep finding those opportunities. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. If you can take the slides now.
Thank you. We were, those of us here, I know, were listened with rapt interest throughout all of that, and in admiration of the leadership that you've had in various contexts. We are able to have questions. The ask is for people to approach the microphone if you have a question for Dr. Ferrini-Mundy. I think I see someone approaching. No. I certainly have several questions that if I were one-on-one with you, I'd be eager to ask. So perhaps I'll start one. As you noted, there's a very, very different context developing with respect to both the government itself and the funding that it's making, and also the ways that there's been kind of this growth of intermediary organizations that are, whose role is to kind of package and disseminate things to policymakers. If you were let's say that you were at an earlier stage of your career, Joan, and that you were in this context, how would you think about ways to have both the public and policymakers become more discerning about that changed ecosystem? Because it's so very different from what you came up in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it is and it isn't, right? Every administration, every presidential administration will bring new perspectives, new approaches to things. And so the intermediary organizations always do need to be really very willing to be flexible, I think, and size up the current context as well as they possibly can, get to know key people in any current moment. And we've been finding the need to do that in a variety of ways in activities that I'm involved in right now. It's kind of like who's going to be influential right now? And how do we find out what they know and how they feel about educational research? And then how can our organization be ready and available as an intermediary to help answer the kinds of questions that they might have? So I think a lot of it is spending time with the current stakeholders who are closer to the policy table perhaps than the intermediary organizations, and being quite willing to adjust the agenda to form responses to what they might find most useful.
Thank you. Is there anyone who'd like to approach to ask Joan a question? I have many, but I don't want to hog the podium as moderator.
And I can't see, so you might be talking to a small group, but, happy to just have a conversation.
Here's someone. Let's see. Oh. She's trying to get the mic to work.
Oh, okay, now it's working.
There you go.
As an early stage career assistant professor, I would like your advice, because we always know that we need to use our research for policy, right? When we are doing research about culturally sustaining practices in education and that kind of topics that we know that they're not eligible for federal funding, and that maybe we will have to look for funding in nonprofit organizations and things like that. What would be your advice for me in this stage of my career to translate my research fundings to policy in this current environment, right? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. And would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I am Laura Cardona Berrio, an assistant professor at Tamus CC Corpus Christi.
Great, thank you. Nice to meet you, Laura.
Nice to meet you.
It's a great question, and one point I think I would make is that not all of our research needs to be immediately translatable into policy. I think that there's always going to be a need in every field, and particularly in ours, for more fundamental work that enriches our understandings, that can help address problems that exist today and that are problems for the future, and that maybe translate more into practice in ways that are less sort of less visible naturally, but equally important in making a difference locally. So that's kind of one point. If one has an interest in research that could inform policy, then I think it's a different situation, because getting some funding is important. Working to get funding from the federal government, it's a changing landscape right now, but figuring out a little bit where there is funding. I know that this workforce topic is getting so much traction quickly that if there are ways to reframe your research questions so that you don't walk away at all from your current interest or your commitments or your values, but at the same time try to put them in different frames, that might make it more possible to be eligible for funding from sources that we haven't typically thought of in educational research, but where there might be some possibilities. Other agencies beyond the Department of Education, beyond the National Science Foundation. And then, of course, with private philanthropy, there's been a pretty big shift, I think, already to a lot of people trying to figure out how to partner there. And that's a bit of a different exercise, as I'm sure you know, less of a chance that there will be solicitations that call for everybody to kind of put their best ideas forward. And in many cases, more of a build a relationship with those organizations and individuals in them to follow their interests. So that's a bit different, but I do think that's a very important source right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. If I may, is there anyone from the audience who would? I think one of the elements that I've been grappling with, and I know that that some of the AERA staff are as well, has to do with. Sorry, I was going to get my notes. Thinking about the current educational research infrastructure at the federal level, the National Science Foundation, the Institute of Education Sciences within the Department of Education. What are some of the, you've mentioned many possible strategies, and I really like this one that you mentioned of sort of capitalizing on policy to say, yes, there are opportunities here. They may not have been, the priorities that we as educators would most like to see right now, but we're not going to just reject them wholesale. I think that's wise. Mm-hmm. If you were thinking about the current, funding and some policy and political challenges related to the Institute of Education Sciences, where would you advise the educational and scientific research community to begin to in this kind of environment to make the case for building back strategic investments? Where do you think that you would look for some initial toeholds?
It's a great question. It's a hard question too, Liz. I think it's important to bring people together kind of maybe in more interdisciplinary ways, perhaps, than we've necessarily done well in education. I know here at our university, when I have computer scientists and engineers and K through 12 teachers and education researchers together about kind of just simply sharing the sorts of challenges that people have in trying to do their work well, with an education or a workforce focus, you do get pretty generative conversations. So, maybe it's something like a few focused conferences and workshops that could be a bit less expensive than a full-blown massive study, to bring together around a specific thing, whether it is, can AI really support learning? And what would that look like? What studies would we need to do to make that understandable? Or any number of other topics about, I'll go back to my REU topic. I still am curious about that. Would love to see more on that. But I think to bring people together who come from different perspectives and pause or put to the side for the moment what the particular educational research interests might be of the education people in the room, but instead be the sponsor, be the lead for the meeting. When I was at NSF, and I was fortunate to be named the head of the education directorate. And one of my mentors and my boss at the time called me in and she said, okay, here's advice. Don't lead with education in every meeting that you're in. Lead with an understanding of the bigger picture, an understanding of the agency, an understanding of what might be happening in the mathematical area or in computer science and so forth. I think that's not bad either in trying to formulate and bring supporters along for research initiatives that would be important in education.
Wonderful. You've given us so much to think about. I believe that, yes, someone's approaching.
It's so weird not being able to see.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Tracy Dobie.
I'm not there.
I'm Tracy Dobie. I'm at the University of Utah, and I work in the space of math education, and we've been working on standards. So I was interested in your discussion about the math standards. And one thing I've been talking to people about across a few different spaces is the role of kind of helping families, parents understand, what's happening in math education, what we're trying to do. Obviously, there's competing narratives that are out there. And with the science of math stuff, there's like a lot of discussions happening. And so we've been talking about how to more effectively sort of communicate to families the reasons why we do what we do in math and support them through that. And so I was just wondering, as you were talking about having different stakeholders involved and voices, like, what you've seen or done that has worked well to get families and communities involved, or if you have any thoughts in that space. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. And I think it's another community and set of stakeholders that are pretty important, and how to effectively engage them is a very hard question, right? I will give you one example, and I can't claim it had much impact other than on a very small set of people, but some of you do know who Karen King was, a very strong, wonderful mathematics educator and a friend and colleague of mine. We were together at NSF for a while, and we decided to host something called a Lunch and Learn, help your kids with math, like help your children with their math. So we did that inside the agency because we had been noticing that there were some staff in the agency who probably, as spreadsheets were becoming more central and so forth, who probably would benefit from a little bit of a refresher in their own math area. So we did this thing, and we had small groups, and they would come, and the requirement was you had to bring your child's or the person you were taking care of or your grandchild, you had to bring their homework. And you had to bring their attempt at doing their homework with you. So that was kind of the admissions ticket. And then we did it was like teaching. I mean, we would have the parent and, the work, and we'd all look it over and, well, what did the student really, what were they thinking and so forth. And I remember we had one guy who was so excited. He was very sharp about algebra once we kind of got him talking, and he said, I'm taking my kids to a baseball game tonight. We're going to work on this while we're there. I said, well, that's probably not the best. Like, you don't want to necessarily have this. But anyway, what we were able to do when parents would say, I can do the problem, I can do the subtraction problem, but I can't do it the way my child is being taught. We were able to try to, through very concrete examples, show them why the thing their child was being taught was actually okay and maybe even better than a sort of rote approach. So maybe there are ways to offer a neighborhood math clinic with something that engages the parents together with kids. We're talking here about engaging some of our pre-service teachers in some kind of a setting that would have them engage with parents and children. So it's really worthwhile. I'm not so I think it has to be a little bit grounded in whatever problem that parent or community feels that they have.
Great. Thank you.
Again, I'm reluctant to hog the stage, but I have lots of interesting questions. Joan, I know that when we spoke earlier, we talked a bit about, I had sort of put out there as a proposition, a self-evident proposition, I thought, that most Americans, and even, on a bipartisan basis, there would be support for NAEP. Let's start with rebuilding and reinvesting in NAEP. And you said something that kind of challenged my conventional thinking that also gets into this question of the difficult task of building public consensus. And that had to do with the fact that NAEP was not universally embraced in the state of Maine. I wonder if you could tell a bit about that story and maybe what we might glean from that about this relationship between the public in one state and then just gaining a consensus even on that slightly smaller public stage.
Yeah, no, it's a great example, and I want to be very, of course, deferential and supportive of my colleagues here in Maine, but our NAEP scores have been not good, and that's very public, and so that kind of thing makes headlines and causes political leaders to ask questions and to be curious about what it is, and I actually think that the education community that's concerned about this has some pretty interesting responses that have to do with somewhat technical matters of the sampling schemes that are used and the numbers of students who are identified as needing special education services, and even more recently the use of technology in the administration of NAEP and what that means for the response rates and so forth. So I think we're very proud here in Maine of what we've been able to do with standards and what we're doing to try to enable, the learner to be successful as an entire human, as well as, of course, in specific areas. But this bad NAEP, these bad NAEP headlines, we're making it hard here in Maine to say, well, it's not quite as, some of the narrative was, it's really not quite as bad as you think it is because of this, and this, which always sounded sort of like technical excuses. And then going on to say, but look at what our own state tests tell us. And, some could interpret that to be more positive than NAEP. So the big lesson is, that things that we would assume are uncontested, like NAEP, it's longitudinal. It's got all kinds of very fancy psychometricians and people around it. Even those have to go back through this sort of thing I described earlier, which is start where the public is, start where local leaders and local educators are, and realize that there may be a discussion to be had even there about, even though we don't like necessarily what these results say, they are findings that have some advantage in terms of their national benchmarking and other things. So it's been a really interesting discussion, and I was surprised that we would even be in that discussion.
Yeah, I think that this question of public consensus that you highlighted becomes one that we should all take to heart, and as you have pointed out to me and everyone, not just take for granted that there are common understandings, that this is, something
you have to redo them every time, kind of. Yeah.
Do I see any other questions? Joan, the reason that I am being so persistent in my own is that I have so much curiosity, and I can assure you I'm not crowding anyone out at the ground here. I'm interested in because your job now and your role entails making the case not just for math, science, and technology, but for a range of students from across Maine who perhaps love literature, want to create art. What is your role and the role of a public university president in making an affirmative case for the liberal arts?
I think great question again, and there would be people on my campus who would say that I need to do better at that, and that's probably true. I think, to be honest, for me, AI is going to be a pathway to being able to rethink some of that discussion. Because the more I learn about it myself, the more I read, I can see that so many of the very, very important kinds of capabilities that come through work in the humanities and the arts and in the liberal arts involve, some of those are really central to good use of AI. Everything from ethical discussions of ethics to use of critical thinking to the ability to evaluate and assess logic and believability of what we're seeing in AI, to the formulation of the prompts, which is its own whole new area of discussion, and how to do those well and how to get what one wants as a result by putting in the right prompt and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something there about the very important place that the important influences of our general education curriculum and enabling people to be ready for the world as they see it. But I will say that I mentioned this research learning experience program that we have, and talked about how we've been able at the university to get this embedded across the university. There was an initial fear that the only people that would take this up would be researchers in the biological sciences, the engineers, the mathematicians, the physical scientists, and so forth. We've really worked hard to be sure that there are courses in the arts and courses in the humanities that offer students a chance to be engaged in creative activity or creative production and scholarship very, very early, and to learn a bit about modes of inquiry across these different domains, which it very much centers those domains as having a place in this bigger discussion of preparing students who can be thinkers and problem solvers in whatever areas they may choose, and who can bring a level of understanding of humanity and ability to make humans part of the loop, I guess, if we had to say, relative to the AI world, really critical right now. But I think for me, being effective in thinking harder about that and talking about it is definitely kind of on my to-do list.
Well, I think that you did that beautifully. I believe that. Yes, please ask.
I'm back again. It's Tracy. I have a question in a little different space. I'm curious to hear about your kind of lessons you've learned from your experiences in leadership. What I'm seeing is, like, I'm a new associate professor now, and I see a lot of people going into leadership positions who are not trained for it, and there's not a lot of support for those of us who are interested to learn always. And so I'm curious, kind of from the various leadership positions you've held, and whether it's kind of your experience as a woman in leadership or just leadership more broadly, but what are some of the challenges that you work through, or like core lessons learned, or maybe like if you were going to support scholars who are interested in going down that path, what do you think are sort of some of the core areas of focus that you'd want to see?
Thank you, Tracy. That's a really interesting question, and I will say that I'm my own pathway was really one that was possible because of serendipity and people who believed that I could do something, and sometimes that there was just nobody else willing to everybody else stepped back, and I was there. It's always, I think it's always a combination of that. Interestingly, I just had lunch with my daughter today, who's in a corporate setting and trying to work her way through and figure out how to do what she wants to do. And she said, I'm not progressing enough. And she said, maybe I need to act more like I could be in those jobs. And that is a piece of advice that I've had before. Kind of picture the job you think you want and try in the job you're in to behave as though you were in that other job to the extent that you can. I think I've done that looking back a little bit. One of the best training or professional development opportunities I had was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. They do a President's Boot Camp, and they do other kinds of leadership training as well. And I found it really helpful, in part because it helped me find a cohort of people that I'm still close to today. So the networks, the people that you've known along the way, people who are more senior or who had these experience, plus just peers who may be thinking about the same thing. There's a lot of sharing that can go on. I think as a woman in mathematics, generationally, that continues to shift and improve, but being accustomed to speaking up, deciding when to speak up in groups, even when you're not quite at the leadership level you'd like to be, can be pretty important and helpful when it might feel more comfortable to be more quiet. I don't really have a kind of game plan. Even retrospectively, it's hard for me to lay that out. But I do think finding people who are mentors or can be mentors, not hesitating to ask people for a chat every now and then. I have a university president friend that I really just met a few months ago, and I call her sometimes, like, this thing's happening to me. I need your help and advice. That's really been important. So good luck to you in that. And we need good leaders at all kinds of levels. And so I hope you find a good pathway.
Thank you.
Well, Joan, on behalf of the Governmental Relations Committee and AERA, we want to thank you again for this presentation. And I think that it's an added benefit that it is going to be available to the membership at large now that it's been recorded. So again, could we please have a round of applause for our speaker?
Thank you.